Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Cyber Conflict and Democratic Institutions. I'm very excited about the conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. This is an area that's of enormous interest to me personally. And I'm going to sort of jump right into the conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then kind of get going. So I hope we're going to have quite a few minutes at the end for questions. So if you have those, please feel free to note them down. So starting on my far left, we have Ronaldo Lemos, the director of the Instituto de Tecnología en Sociedad de Rio de Janeiro. Sorry, tripping over that one a little bit. To his right, Sean Canuck, an affiliate at Stanford CSAC. To his right, Camille Francois, a principal researcher at Jigsaw, which is part of Alphabet. And immediately to my left, Matthew Waxman, a professor at Columbia Law School. And my name is Susan McGregor. So obviously, in the past 6 or 8 months, I think there's been quite a lot of attention paid to the influence and effect that networked communications, digital communications can have on democratic institutions. Most notably here in the US and in Europe, there's been a lot of concern about influence and manipulation of electoral politics. This is cited just even this week. There have been some issues, I think it was yesterday or the day before, in the French election, the role of information that allegedly has come out about one of the candidates that has sort of cycled up from, the bottom of the internet pool, if you will, all the way up to being mentioned on national television in France. And so there's quite a lot of concern about what role these forces can play in influencing democratic institutions. And so one of the places that I want to start this conversation is actually with Sean, who wrote a wonderful framing paper for this panel. I encourage you all to read it. It's a very nice, concise representation of some of the questions here. But I think represents one of the big questions that we encounter when we think about networked communications, whether it has to do with data, privacy, all of these things, which is at what point the quantitative becomes qualitative. So obviously influence campaigns, propaganda, whether nationally or internationally, are nothing new to politics, and yet I think we find ourselves globally at this moment feeling like something has changed. And so I wonder if you could sort of set us up to talk a little bit about how you see these technologies enacting this change and whether and how we should be thinking about them differently from previous instances.
Sure. And first off, thank you to Columbia and CEPA, the sponsors, for organizing this and inviting me to participate. I tip my hat to them putting the hacking question late in the afternoon because I think it'll keep people's attention. The structure I laid out in the framing paper, and I'll just say in a couple sentences, is making that distinction between direct intervention in an election, vote tampering or disrupting voter databases or intimidating voters going to the polls, versus indirect influence. And in that indirect influence side, you have persuasion, people who aren't candidates, who aren't even citizens of that country, weighing in and giving their opinion. But then you have this other category, the indirect influence, but that's done surreptitiously or under false pretenses or false identities. And I think that's at the core of the concern in the United States regarding the potential activities and disruptions of the US election, what they're talking about in France now. And where is that aversion we have? Because I will offer outside influence in foreign elections is nothing new. We had that with efforts by Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and we can find other examples, right? Then you have the issue of it being covert and done through espionage. Well, that's not something new either, right? That goes back to time immemorial. So what's the real problem here? And one of the earlier panels mentioned the Opm hack, and so I'll use that as the reference point. You get US senior intelligence officials who have said that they themselves would have targeted that kind of a database in a foreign country because it was legitimate state espionage target. Yet, you have a lot of folks in the US government in that same community saying what happened at OPM was unacceptable. Why? Because of the scale or scope, the quantitative features that you just mentioned. It was too good, too successful, too minimum on cost for the perpetrator compared to cost on the victim. It could be done from too far away without risk to the perpetrator. Did the quantitative aspects of that destabilize the relationship so much that it became a qualitative issue? And I've been pressed on this before, and I've thought really hard of, can I think of any other example? And I think it was back in the 70s where there were so many Soviet bloc spies running around London that MI5 didn't have enough people to follow them all. And basically did a huge persona non grata, PNG purging, of hundreds of Eastern Bloc diplomats to sort of hit the reset button. And I think that's what we're seeing. I think you're seeing a claim made that there is a qualitative change or a qualitative imbalance because of how effective cyber espionage can be, and especially if you marry it with an influence operation in a democratic society. So I think that's the visceral concern, and I appreciate that, at the same time that I will offer espionage and trying to influence a foreign election are absolutely nothing new. So have we actually hit a qualitative tipping point simply because of quantitative improvements in digital espionage and social media exposure? I don't know. At an intellectual level, I don't know. But I'll say on a societal level, that certainly seems to be the foundation of the objection we're hearing.
Thank you. And so, I think I'm reminded of the fact, for example, that among other efforts, Facebook this week announced that they had undertaken a huge effort to purge fake accounts from their platform, and that in doing so, the only figure that they seem to have publicly shared is that they purged 30,000 fake accounts in France alone. And that they did this actually without doing any kind of content analysis. This was mostly metadata. They were kind of looking at frequency of posting and reposting and things like that, which raises another, I think, relevant point, which is that most of these companies, most of these platforms are private institutions, right? I mean, there's nothing that was preventing Facebook from doing this a year ago or 5 years ago. I would argue the technology isn't new, but also the role, so I think also there's some piece of this that has to do with the fact that these are private platforms. I want to move on though, because I think I think in this room we probably have an understanding of the concerns about the destabilizing effect, the concerns about how that scale plays into that, the level of destabilization. I take it to you, Ronaldo, because your work is emblematic of exactly the opposite, which is how that kind of involvement, that kind of leveraging of social platforms, of participation, can yield an entirely new and unprecedented level of democratic engagement and strengthening those institutions. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about your efforts with the sort of the civil rights for the internet in Brazil, and I think particularly tied to not only creating that engagement, but dealing with some of the issues that I think plague potentially the propaganda world, which is, how do we know these are real people? How do we know that what's represented in that process is genuine and is not, the result of the astroturfing of a few actors who've embedded themselves in the system?
Right, okay, so these are all important questions, and just to start, I have to say that I'm concerned myself with the same reasons that we've been talking here. So just to give you an example, Cambridge Analytica just opened an office in Brazil. We have presidential elections next year. Coincidence? Probably not. And the issue here is the following. At one side, I'm very optimistic about the role of technology for democracy. I know that it works for a fact, because I was involved for 7 years in building Brazil's Internet Bill of Rights. It was possibly one of the very first complex legislation pieces that were actually drafted and built collaboratively through an online platform, in which we designed this platform for this specific purpose of building this particular law. This entire process, it took more than 7 years. It involved both online activities mainly, but a lot of offline consultations as well, forums that were organized all over Brazil, for instance, so that people that were not connected had the chance also to participate. And this was a very successful process. The outcome is very positive. The legislation is sophisticated. It was well designed. the fact that it was collaborative was recognized as very positive. You had like an international impact, for instance, with people like Tim Berners-Lee basically saying that this should be regarded as a model law for other countries as well. And you have other countries like Italy doing their declaration of internet rights as well, acknowledging an influence also of the Brazilian process, as the city of Mexico did something somehow similar recently to write their own constitution and so on. So this, I think, it was important in terms of process. So a few lessons learned. If we had conducted that conversation and that design of this particular law on Facebook, probably it wouldn't have worked. And one of the reasons that we saw in Brazil recently in our recent presidential election, and soon after that our impeachment of the president elected, was that Facebook was not originally designed for political debates. It's very hard to find a synthesis between two opposing positions on Facebook. Facebook is not made to build any sort of synthesis. It's basically meant for people to expose and share certain things that they care and occupy space here and there, but not really provoke like an informed debate that is capable of producing a synthesis. Another handicap, or I would say in terms of political possibility, is that it has no memory. So if you want to reconstruct the debates that happened in the US presidential election, for instance, which were very rich, you will have to go through like millions of different timelines in which that information has been buried. So this is not designed to discuss politics. Why are we using this to discuss politics? So shouldn't we as a society and like as NGOs, as the academic sector, the scientific sector, use a little bit of our efforts to build and design platforms that are actually capable of hosting informed political debates, capable of producing synthesis? So that's one of the questions that I have. And the other question is, what is the accountability in the sense that like what can be done? I see the fake news debate, and in my view, it's in most of the cases a problem of missing information rather than fake information. So if people had the capability of knowing where does that came from, who paid for this particular piece of news? Is this from a political party, from a political movement? You know, if you had more information about what you read, I think this problem could be much less concerning than it is right now. So my question is, are we capable of building the tools that are necessary for improving and increasing the level of information? So, yeah.
Well, that brings me very naturally to your work, Camille. So Project Jigsaw is an effort that looks at, I would say, very complex problems in the human-computer space, in the networked communication space, many of them, and some of which have taken on exactly these kinds of issues, which is how do we build accountability, but also in exactly the same way, you know, leverages those networked communications to disrupt some of the disrupting influences that we see. So I think one of them that has gotten some of the most attention is known as Project Redirect, which essentially, and please correct me on this, you know, identifies patterns of search behavior by individuals who are perhaps on the road to radicalization, and essentially tweaks the information that is provided to them to kind of redirect them away from that. And so, Camille, I'd love if you could share with us a little bit about, and I know there's quite a lot of different projects that you all do at Jigsaw, but some of the work that kind of ties into this, and again, I know some of it actually has very directly to do with the accountability that Ronaldo mentions, but you know, how can we be thinking about using these networked systems also to engage and in some cases maybe dismantle these destabilizing networks and patterns of behavior?
Sure. Let me just say a word on redirect, because it's a little bit of an odd story, and I think sometimes it can be mistaken for we're changing the way people are getting this information, which is not the case. What we're doing is a basic advertising campaign. And so we're using the tools that any advertiser can use, and basically we have talked to young jihadi recruits, or young people who... It's the hair. Got it? Much better. Young people who have been radicalized on the internet and who have been consuming ISIS propaganda and decided to join the caliphate. And when we interviewed them, we realized that they were looking for information and sometimes looking for very specific sets of very rational questions. So to give you an example, talking to young women, what they were interested in doing is becoming nurses in hospitals in the caliphate. And so they were on the internet looking for videos and information about the state of hospitals in the caliphate. And of course, what they encounter is ISIS propaganda, right? The answer to that question that you would find becomes ISIS propaganda. And so what we said is, there's other information out there, notably in citizen media, notably in citizen journalism, notably by people who have been brave enough to film inside these hospitals and the caliphate on the ground with, shaky mobile phones. And those videos we can highlight by giving them as advertising to any person who would search for state of the hospitals in the caliphate. So it's an advertising campaign. The content that we're serving is really citizen journalism content. And the sort of base assumption is we're gonna take people's questions seriously. We're not gonna say, if you're looking for ISIS propaganda on the internet, you're either crazy or you're a human rights watch researcher. We're gonna say, maybe there is a question that we can serve you an advertisement. So we're not pretending that it's not an advertisement that you might be also interested in. So that's for redirect. For network propaganda, which is sort of the big thing that on my end I'm working on right now, Sean, I agree with you. It's not new, right? And it's not surprising, and it's quite straightforward. And I hear that a lot, it's very clear in the information operations doctrine. Why is everyone surprised? But it's sort of still remains the case that it was not the deal. We didn't do the internet so that people could be massively manipulated by state-sponsored campaigns that paused as foreign citizens pretending to have debates online. And so it's neither new nor surprising, but it's still, presenting us with a challenge that we weren't prepared for, and we're still being manipulated in the way that we should have expected, but we're not really good at detecting. And so when we see these sorts of, movements of support on the internet on very political topics, it's becoming a very legitimate question. Say, if you're a member of the press, to just look at it and say, okay, is this a genuine expression of a citizen movement that are happening to use Twitter? Is this hashtag organic? Or all these people who are trying to have this debate over this piece of information, my fellow citizens who are engaging in a political conversation with me? Or am I looking at a weird mix of social bots and the paid trolls and the inorganic activity that's actually on a government budget? And I think that's a very legitimate question. Again, it's neither surprising or new, but it's sort of like the state that we're in. And when we're asking ourselves that question and looking at the internet, we don't really have a lot of tools to sort of be able to answer that. And so one of the key things we're trying to do is, what are the analytical tools that we can put in users' hands to start to answer this question? This requires talking to a lot of people who are somewhere on this production chain of bad information, right? And then this is sort of how you realize that a lot of the things that's portrayed as organic badness from the internet, sometimes people would tell you oh yeah, propaganda and trolling, it's really too bad. People are mean on the internet. You're no, that's this is a bot network that was bought on a criminal forum that is serving to diversify the IP of a bulk of fake Twitter accounts that was bought to another criminal operation abroad. And so it's not that people are mean on the internet, it's that you are looking at something that is a well-organized, well-funded, well-coordinated criminal activity that sometimes borders on espionage and that sometimes is state-sponsored. And so looking into how this, concretely works and developing all the tools we can, both from an analytical perspective, but also from, platform responsibility perspective, I think is our focus. Just to give one quick example of what this can look like from a platform responsibility perspective, and that time on the hacking side, something that we rolled out a couple years ago is this little notice in Gmail that we call the government-backed attack warning. I don't know if anyone in this room has ever been served this warning. We serve it to less than 0.1% of our Gmail users. Basically, this is the little message that you get when Google knows that a state-sponsored actor is trying to get into your mailbox. Maybe it's through a phishing attempt, maybe it's a malware, and basically Google is serving you a little notice saying, hey, we have reasons to believe that state attackers are targeting your inbox. And these are recommendations that we would really like you to consider to secure your inbox. So, as Eric said this morning, please, it's the right time to turn on two-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a good responsibility position to be in. Telling people it's different to say, yo, there's malware on the internet, kind of sucks, and then to tell them, well, sometimes we have reasons to believe that you're targeted as part of a campaign by well-organized, well-funded adversaries, and there are very specific set of recommendations that apply to you in that case.
Well, you brought us very neatly to Professor Waxman. So I think, yes, this idea of I really like that sort of evolution, because I think there is this attitude of, people are mean on the internet, they do bad things. And I have to say that in my own work, with journalists, and particularly journalists and academics abroad, was probably the first time about a year and a half ago that I encountered people who said, oh yeah, we know that the government has paid 6,000 people to troll us. And, I know that if I post something on Twitter, I am going to be just harassed off that platform because, I've produced coverage that's critical of the government, or I've done this. And I think that that's something that is as is not always, or is not so seldom the case, is a little bit late to the U.S. consciousness that this is the kind of activity that is not uncommon in many parts of the world. But what you cite about this idea of state-sponsored activities perhaps giving the appearance of many individuals, of networks, I think really brings us to what I'm interested in hearing from you, Matthew, is at what point do we then decide that this legitimate espionage, some maybe legitimate espionage, but in any case, potentially state-sponsored activity constitutes an act of war? So you were recently before the U.S. Senate, I believe, and you were asked this question, and I think as a citizen, as an individual, I'm very curious about this, because of course, this may be what we're looking at when we think about conflict. Is this going to get, the U.S. or any other nation into an actual war?
Yeah, so I have found in policy discussions, including legislative ones, a tendency to ask the question and even answer it in the affirmative. Does, let's say, Russian interference in elections constitute an act of war, or should we declare it as such? And I want to reflect a little bit on some observations about that debate. Let me sort of jump to my own conclusion, which is I'd be very skeptical and hesitant of taking that move. For reasons I'll explain. I think I can see why certain political leaders would find it an attractive thing to state as a position to take, but from a policy standpoint, I think it's a very problematic one. That said, I think if we sort of dissect the debate and discussion a bit, there are some important elements of a strategy for combating political interference generally, but especially through new digital means. So, when I think about why might it be desirable to say that election interfering constitutes an act of war? the legal technical term would usually be armed attack, meaning something that justifies a state's full rights of self-defense, including and up to and including military force. Why might a state want to take that position? One reason is about sort of motivating and harnessing domestic politics. It's about elevating the importance of an issue. And there's some logic and merit to this. That in order to make sure that government resources, private sector resources are brought to bear in combating certain threats, it may be helpful to label them as act of war. It's a way of basically marking the importance of an issue, elevating the stakes or making clear the stakes of an issue. So perhaps as a way of kind of motivating domestic politics, the label of act of war could be useful. I think the downside of this, or a downside of this, is that precisely because it is motivating, it may also be hand-tying. That declaring something an act of war doesn't usually just mean that you may treat it as an act of war. It usually means that you have to treat it as an act of war. If you don't, then you are kind of, in a sense, not fulfilling your government responsibilities to protect the public and the state from an attack. So it has certain advantages from a political standpoint, but those advantages may be a little bit too confining, or perhaps even in some ways a little bit too strong. Another reason why you might want to label political interference as an act of war is to help try to establish international norms prohibiting certain content. Here I'm skeptical because I think the norm that's involved here, or the effort to create a clear and enforce a clear norm, is unclear. I would associate myself with the position that Sean laid out, which is political interference is a really, really old instrument of statecraft. You know, the Washington administration, the George Washington administration, was dealing with political interference. One of the biggest foreign policy crises of the Washington administration was dealing with French efforts to interfere with our domestic politics and go directly to the people and enlist public support for French efforts in their European war. This is a long-standing issue. I don't think the prohibition or the red line that we would want to draw on political interference, especially when we engage in some political interference abroad, is an easy one to draw. What kind of interference, by what means, for what purpose are we saying is problematic? So it's also something that's sharply good. It's going to divide states. Finally, the last reason I would just offer that you might want to label something an act of war is deterrence. An advantage of labeling something an act of war is it opens up a fuller range of possible responses. I would actually argue that labeling political interference an act of war may, in the long run, be problematic for deterrence, because I think it will be very, very difficult to maintain the credibility of a threatened response to political interference, given that it is such a prevalent instrument of statecraft. I would just conclude by saying that while I'm skeptical of efforts to label political interference, even using new digital means that may have some new qualitative features to them, I'm skeptical of that. I do think that that we do need to think about how do we bolster our domestic politics against political interference. We do need to think about the cultivation of certain norms, and we do need to think hard about deterrence.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that for me, this is a particularly central question, because I'm really drawn to the fact that, or the question that really drives me is, I think, if we were to declare it, if we were to say that such activities constitute an act of war, on whom would we declare that war? And what would a deterrent look like? And I think to me that's sort of the more interesting question because, realistically, I think we know both in, quasi-conventional warfare, and even more particularly in the cyber realm, that, we're not necessarily talking about nation states, or we're talking about nation states, and while we may be partly talking about nation states, we're also talking about very small, dispersed networks of individuals, sometimes a single individual that can wreak, enormous disruption on these institutions. And so I'm curious, again, from those of you who've worked in this space, where do you see, what kinds of systems do you think might be effective? I mean, again, I think the driver of this is this idea that, or the concern might be that if we declare an act of war, one of those responses might be the geopolitically based fragmentation of the internet, right? As the theme that we've seen here today, that, more nations are going to go the route of trying to shut down, access to their networks. They're going to have, red buttons to turn off social media. They're going to continue to use tools like DNS manipulation, closing down their networked borders. But especially given that the threats are often not so well defined, what are some of the strategies? Is it really not more the idea of kind of, organized societies against, against these more dispersed networks? And so, again, I'm wondering, Camille, I know that you have some work in this space, and Ronaldo, what are the ways that we engage, what are the tools that we can use to kind of dismantle some of those networks to reduce their influence, and I think kind of preserve the order so that we don't see this situation where maybe for domestic political reasons we are, declaring war, but then the question of how we actually enact that deterrent feature happens.
Okay.
Ronaldo, do you want to?
All right. I'm not sure if I have a full answer to your question.
You have to answer the whole thing
right.
and solve it now.
Yes, but some comments. I think it's important. I think thinking about this, framing it as an act of war, it's it can cause a lot of concerns for countries that don't have war capabilities or cyber warfare capabilities, and I would assume it's probably 90% of the countries. And that would also have a side effect of making technology perceived as a potential military tool, and I don't think you should want to go there, because I think we are living in a moment in which we have an overall perception of declining trust in institutions. So I was just reading the Edelman Barometer report recently, and well, it's not a surprise for anyone, but trust is declining regarding the press and government. And the only two organizations or institutions that are above the 50% line are the business sector and NGOs. They're all declining too, but the pace seems to be a little bit slower. Yes. So, I'm afraid that we need to build efforts that can reconstruct and rebuild trust rather than increase distrust, because we are living through a distrust crisis internally and internationally. And from my small experience, one thing that we have been doing in Brazil, for instance, is using the blockchain technology, which is an open, decentralized, distributed platform in order to build transparency, accountability, and improving, for instance, transparency for political parties, and building voting participation methods based on the blockchain. So very quickly, because I don't want to take too much time, my institute just launched 2 weeks ago an application called Mudamos. It stands for We Change, and it allows you to vote on a popular initiative law. So the Brazilian Constitution says that if 1% of the voters get together and propose a law, that law must be taken by Congress officially. That will take that law as if had been proposed by a Congress member. Problem is, that is 1.6 million signatures, and to get those on paper, It's very difficult. In the history of the Brazilian Constitution, it was used only 4 times with mixed results. But now, using the blockchain and certifying the identity of Brazilian voters, this process, they can escalate. So the emergence of the blockchain allowed a form of democratic participation that was impossible 2 years ago. And I think we should move in that direction, building technologies that improve trust rather than distrust.
Yeah, I agree. I think trust is really the central issue. We talked a little bit about the protect part of it, and I think it's a huge piece of the puzzle. A lot of the information systems we use are not secure. A lot of our digital security practices could be much more better. It's definitely the case when elections are, like it's definitely the case in many unfolding elections. So there's a big protect part of it. And then there's the detect, analyze, and expose sort of trifecta, right? So if you know that there are certain information operations campaigns that are targeting social media, how do you detect them? How do you analyze which piece of it is a network of bots and which piece of it is sort of like, you know, the legitimate conversation that's layered on top? And then how do you expose so that people can decide whatever they want to do with it? You know, journalists will do an analytical piece. Some will decide that they want to go after the underlying botnet and disrupt it. But just like, you know, infusing back the information into the public sphere of what is going on, how does it work, how does it impact you, how can you detect it, and then ensuring that people are well protected in their own practices.
So then that brings me to a question which has come up, you know, earlier today in a couple of the panels, in the trust and assurance, in the previous panel, the assurance panel before this. It's been pointed out that no one's really regulating this space, right? And so I'm curious, you know, from, you know, even if we consider this work, you know, maybe it's legitimate espionage, maybe it has a different flavor, but I mean, we know that private companies are engaging in this space. I mean, we know that, you know, companies like Google and Microsoft and, you know, even the social platforms now are doing it. But is that enough? I mean, if we are going to get to the point where we even consider the idea that, you know, this kind of work could constitute an act of war, I mean, would we be declaring war because because there was an influence campaign with a bunch of fake networks that was maybe just a couple of people? I'm wondering, you know, Sean and Matthew, whether you have thoughts about, I mean, should we be actually at a point, if we think that this has such influence, that, you know, one of the places that nations need to go is to say, hey, if you are going to operate this kind of network, you need to be able to provide this level of accountability in order to operate in our space, because we have to protect, you know, our institutions without going the draconian route of saying, you know, we're just going to cut off participation from anybody who's, you know, who's outside.
I mean, I'll just start, unless Sean, yeah, I mean, I just want to start by saying, you know, a lot of this conversation has been, I think, trying to sort of to take the state out of the discussion, but, you know, a lot of the world is still very state-centric. And when we're talking, for example, about, you know, my read of intelligence, evidence, and that sort of thing is that, you know, for example, when we look back at influences, foreign influences on the U.S. election, there were some private actors that were involved, but it was very, very state-directed, and it would be very easy to justify, therefore, an appropriate state versus state-based reaction, a state-to-state response. That's not to say that it's only states that are operating, but I don't want to exclude them from the discussion. I think another way in which regulation can take place here, and that does continue to emphasize the role of states, is imposing obligations, enforcing obligations for states to police activities that are going on within their territory. Because I do think that while we're talking about some technologies here that are in many ways territory permeable, there are also a lot of activities that are taking place within certain territories, and I think one kind of direction in which international law, international norms, international duties is going is to think about what are the obligations that states have to police actions within their territories or by their nationals. Again, I'm not saying that this is a complete solution. It may be a very, very, very incomplete solution, but I think it is at least part of the solution.
I'm very intrigued and enjoying this conversation, and two cliches are immediately coming to mind. One is the political adage of where you sit determines where you stand, and the other is the old game theory question of who guards the guardians. What we're actually all dancing around here is who is the appropriate ombudsman of truth? Who do you want to be the regulator? Now, if you were King George or the British Parliament in the late 18th century, you would have had a really big problem with a bunch of colonial terrorists who were inciting violence within your jurisdiction. Some of those, by the way, later on went on to write under the astroturfed pseudonym of Publius to show that they were what everyone believed, which of course wasn't true. If you were a part of the Bourbon family, you probably didn't like the Jacobin incitements to violence. Contemporarily, I'm not interested in having the People's Republic of China suppress Falun Gong websites or any other Uyghur activities anywhere. I'm not interested in having Turkey decide if the Armenian genocide ever occurred or not. I'm not interested in having a few media channels find 3 burning buildings in 1989 in California and say that California is burning. We heard that from one of the earlier speakers. I apologize, I'm not interested in Google deciding what should be first on the search list as correcting other information that others are doing. And I can go on and on, right? I could point to probably every organization in this room and anyone I've ever been at and say I'm not fully comfortable trusting them to be the arbiter of truth. So where am I left? This may sound weird coming from a guy who spent his first half of his career in the intelligence community. I may be coming down on the fact of democratic free speech, just like democratic elections, are horribly inefficient and can lead to horribly arresting outcomes at different times. But as horrible as those are, they're still the best of the worst. They're the fastest 3-legged gazelle.
So we're going to move to audience questions in just a moment. But I mean, I think I think I agree with you that at some point trust has to lie somewhere. But I think one of the things that I'm interested in pushing on here is we know that we can get better trust per Ronaldo's example, right? We know that we can get better trust with certain requirements of technology, right? We know that, blockchain technology can give us a trail of a relative audit trail about, where something has happened. We know that if we insist on 2-factor, we can be reasonably assured that if somebody wants to fake an account, first of all, if somebody wants to get into an account, it's going to be harder. Second, if somebody wants to fake an account, it's going to be, at the very least, much more expensive, right? Especially go to countries where you have to submit, an identity for a SIM card, right? I mean, if I'm using SMS, you're going to know that, I've got multiple accounts registered to me. And so I wonder, my question is more to whose job is it to make sure that we're using those, that we're imposing those requirements so that we get that level of accountability so that I can trust the conversations that are happening on social media, that they are real people or that they are, real votes in Brazil. And I guess I'm just sort of curious whether, it seems that, as you say, we're sort of dancing around this, but I'm not sure how we get there unless there is that participation on the policy level from nation states to say, we want this level of accountability in the systems that are going to be part of our political process.
So can I just do a little bit of a cultural, contextual note?
Please.
Ronaldo, I'm going to speak for the both of us, but stop me if it...
All right.
In Portuguese.
In Portuguese.
Great.
Some of us, I think, also are coming from a cultural background in which we thought that truth was also going to be collectively produced on the internet, on the network public sphere, if we could ensure that it was properly distributed that we would avoid central nodes, and that we could infuse enough transparency and respect for privacy, right? And it was really a cultural movement of thinking information will, have to be free. Let's encourage its circulation and translate it into a series of both very technical measures and also legal innovations like Creative Commons. And I don't think that where we are today means that this was a pipe dream. And in many regards, I think that it is still the solution. And in the face of not really knowing who is supposed to be the guardian and the arbiter of truth, we don't have to look for a central node. We just have to ensure that our system of everyone having access to information and being able to discuss, and the network remaining well distributed and transparent and able to respect people's privacy, will still sort of get us to where we want to. Now, I realize this is a very optimistic take on where we are and what the internet can do. It's still my take to date. It doesn't, well, no, I don't.
No, I think I agree with what you said. Just very quickly, I think the issue of truth, and it's one of the most important ones that we have to think about. So in my class here at Columbia, I did recently an exercise with my students in which I asked them, what are the institutions that are actually, that we can rely on in order to determine what is truth? And then they quoted a bunch of institutions, and possibly at the 19th time, a student raised his hand and said, oh, and there is the scientific community, science. And I said, yeah, that's the question that's the answer I was waiting for. So people thought about the press, they thought about TV or whatever, Google. And then after 19 people saying something, someone said, okay, so how about science? And I said, yeah, that's what I wanted to hear. So I see a lot of countries trying to pass laws about fake news. And that concerns me a lot, because what a lot of these laws actually do is to transfer to the judiciary branch the power to determine what is truth and what is not. And the judiciary was not built to determine what truth is. It was built to determine whether something is legal or illegal. It's not the function of the judiciary to actually determine what truth is. So I am concerned about these transferences of outsourcing the determination of truth. So in my view, in the same way that we were talking before, I think our task as a society is basically how to rebuild the institutions that deal with truth. And of course, botnets, fake profiles, online manipulation, speech that is actually propaganda, plain as if it's coming from your regular citizen, but is actually coming from a central propaganda machine that actually sometimes have economic, sometimes have political incentives in order to engage on that. That helps. So I think rebalancing the playing field for speech online, I think it's not a vain effort. I think it's something that can be done. We can come up with tools for that, and I think the impact will be positive.
Okay, well, I've gotten to have my fun up here, so happy to take, I think, actually, if I can impose on people to either to walk to the mic to ask your questions, just because we want to make sure that they're heard by everyone. Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Andrea Glorioso from the European Commission. But I'm asking a question on a personal basis. This was a most interesting panel. I will ask the whole panel, I will make this point. In the US, according to recent research, 20% of citizens are functionally illiterate, which means that they can read and write, but they cannot actually understand what they're reading and writing. The situation in European countries, in some European countries, is much worse than that. In Italy, in my own country, 45% of people are functionally illiterate. They can read and write, but they cannot really understand what they are reading and writing. And my question is, if this is true, and I'm not claiming it is, but research suggests that it is at least partially true, are we aiming our efforts, faced with the kind of challenges that we're discussing now, in the wrong direction. Should we not invest a lot more resources and money into education? I mean, schools, literally teaching people what it means to read a text, what it means to analyze a text, how our civic system or our political systems work, the level of ignorance all across Western societies, how government actually works is staggering, and it is much worse than it is in the 70s and the 80s. So I am a technologist, but I'm wondering in this case if the answer to the political challenges mediated by technology that we're looking for should not be technological at all, should be of a completely different nature. Would be curious to hear the panel's opinions on this.
So if I may paraphrase, I think it's, should we be not looking, is our greatest source of instability perhaps in democratic institutions, perhaps not technology, but actually a lack of understanding and education in the various publics, yeah.
I'm happy to start that, and let me start cheeky and then give my real opinion. The Soviet Union had near perfect literacy rates and some of the highest voter turnout you've ever seen in elections. I wouldn't necessarily want to...
I'm not talking about literacy, sir. I'm talking about functional literacy. It's a different thing.
And my next answer is going to be, so I separate the problem we've been discussing with the one you've raised, and on the one you've raised, my answer is I personally believe that education is not only the core basis of all human improvement and progress, but also international peace. So I would absolutely love to advocate for education on a wide range of boundaries. I'm not sure that education alone by any specific metric of literacy or something else is going to get us to fulfill the principle you've articulated, which I completely agree with.
Other comments? Or? No? All right. Well, we seem to have plenty of questions, so please step forward.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Martin from Barnard College. Great panel. I really enjoyed it. One comment and then one question. The comment is, I think there was a recent study that indicated that some huge percentage of scientific findings were
Irreproducible?
Irreproducible, yes, exactly. So I'm not sure that science is necessarily the answer for a trustworthy institution. But my question is, I think that democracy is fundamentally built on individual responsibility, and that is related to the question of education. But is it really in the good interests of government to be paternalistic in terms of what they tell their citizens they should be looking at and not looking at, or should be paying attention to and not paying attention to? Because anybody who sees these fake news sources, it's not like they're close to being true and that therefore they could persuade people who actually have a knowledge base. At what point do we say people have to take responsibility for their own democracy? So it's a philosophical question related to education.
So again, if I may paraphrase, perhaps the question is the question of influence and fake news and all of this really just a cover for allowing people to pass off responsibility for their decisions, that it's really on the individual to make those judgments?
Can I make a quick quick comment about the science point? But that's the beauty of it. Science can be falsifiable. You can, I think truth is achieved precisely by falsifiability. So in science, if you're proved wrong, you have to move on, something that you don't do in terms of values or religion. And that's how we as a society have come up with achieving some form of truth. And truth is always temporary until you create a better argument and you make it falsifiable again. That's how we evolve as a species, I would say. But I think that's the point. But it's a great comment. And then it comes to the issue whether science has not also been following special interests as well. So who pays for scientific research? These are all important questions, as are who pays for certain pieces of news that end up viral on Facebook or appearing on Google results.
Does anyone want to add to that? I mean, I'll jump in, which is just to say that, I obviously personal accountability, I think, is key. I would say that, and this is something that, so I'm the assistant director of something called the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at the Journalism School, and some work that we've been doing at Tao on platforms and news and all of this. I think one real issue, and I think there's been work at Google that's addresses, is how we signal, how we do or don't provide signals upon which people can make those individual decisions. So a great example is HTTPS, right? Whether or not you have a secured connection to a website, which has a lot to do with the integrity of the it has everything to do with the integrity of the information that you're receiving. I know that there's been years of development at Google and other places about how do we literally just show users, right? Demonstrate that this is a secure connection. And so I do think that there is a place where if we look at, say, fake news on Facebook, agreed, a lot of times, but then again, a lot of legitimate news organizations have fallen to the clickbait headline as well, so it can't rule the press out on that. But there is this veneer of, kind of respectability, right, that just comes from the design, the way that, the way that we perceive that information, and something that is, very, very poorly researched and supported, kind of looks the same. It all kind of runs through your Facebook feed in the same way, and apart from the name on the source, I think is a lot of work to distinguish still. So I think there's space to evolve in the technical and design space as well to signal better to users what's happening. Anyhow, please.
I found that the internet has definitely caused people to have a lack of trust in institution. And in a way it's positive because it has opened our understanding of what's going on. At the same time, people can be misinformed. And there's a sense also of inequality. We don't have the same access, the same mastery of the internet. And I think that people who have a vested interest in the internet should definitely look into empowering customers, or users, but autocratic government, non-democratic government, businesses, they all have conflicting interests and they all have a vested interest in misleading users. So who is guarding the wolf is guarding the wolf, the thieves are guarding the thieves. But anyway, but there should be some moderation, I think. It should be a tool that we can use in a relatively good manner. But at the same time, last year, I told the panelists here that the internet is not God, it's a tool. But this year, it's not just a tool. As any tool, it can be used as a toy. Okay? So the Facebook fake news, it's the rumor mill. It has always existed. But nowadays, it's exploding. Territory. So what territory? You're on the internet, okay? The fake news are all the way in Russia. So you're going to tell me I cannot go to Russia to check the information? So I think we should look at this thing with some kind of moderation. We got to be able to, I hate the word regulating. We got to find a way to make it functional. But at the same time, you cannot control it all the way. It's a tool, it's a toy, it's normal. I don't know what your feedback would be on that.
So should we be so worried because it can always go one of either, there's always multiple directions for this to go. It can be used for good, used for ill, like any other tool.
I think so you nailed it when you answered the previous question on it's really about empowering the individuals with as much information, as much tools, as much, way for them to decide how they want to shape this. Because really what we have right now is an unbalanced playing field. I think it's becoming easier to manipulate someone than for someone to act upon pieces of information and tools to realize they're being manipulated. So I like this focus on the individual, which, corporations like to call the user, but it's really just people. They focus on empowering people with tools, information, and really, education is also a part of that story.
Can I, if you don't mind, one thing I'd like to circle back on about that is, again, to some of the work that's been done by folks on this panel, how do we provide those tools to users, right? We talked about some of the technical options, but I noticed in looking at Project Jigsaw's work, there's a lot of human representation and intervention. I saw a lot of projects where I think like Abdullah X and a couple of others, the Against Violent Extremism Network, where you have kind of people talking to people, and I'm wondering, I think to some of the questions that have been raised, how much is this a technology problem and how much is this about, reconnecting human beings so that they're getting a quality of information that is valuable and persuasive to them?
Yeah, it's sort of like a big puzzle that we're looking at. The overall mission is preserve free speech. And so sometimes it is a technical intervention. I'm thinking about Project Shield, for instance, which is our project that protects websites from news organizations and human rights organizations from DDoS attacks. And so the idea is really again, a playing field problem, right? Today, it's dirt cheap to buy a DDoS attack on the internet and to just take off a newspaper's website that you don't like. You don't want their information to be in the network publisphere. You just DDoS them out of existence. End of the story. And so that's that calls for a technical intervention. Let's make sure that this tactic, and again, we can talk about who's the right holder, who's doing this, which, how involved is the state, but you can also focus on the tactic, this tactic of leveraging DDoS to suppress information from the network public sphere, we think shouldn't be one that people have access to. So that calls for technical interventions. Some of the things we do call for a more humane intervention. It's really about, redirect is a good example. It's really about ensuring that some pieces of information also have access to being part of that conversation. And that sometimes means protecting people on the ground because, again, if you want to say citizen journalism and conflict matters, really you also have to make sure that these people are not getting hacked and surveilled and harassed. And so it's always kind of a mix when you look at preserving information online. And I think we do, interventions based on what makes the most sense.
Okay, I think one last question.
I hate to be the person standing between you and the coffee break, but I'm still going to ask a question. When the panel started discussing, discussed the fake news and the debate that you've had around this, one of the things indeed that's worrying with the fake news framing is that we don't really know what's fake, and we don't want the judicial system to regulate what's fake and what's not. And so it's at the same time, and this was an example in the last presidential debate in France. One of the two speakers used a piece of information that had been published a couple of hours ago on a forum. That's not a case of free speech. That's the case of forging a document with the signature of the other person. So let's not overplay the free speech argument either. In some cases, it's not a question of freedom of speech. It's a question of forging documents. It's a question of manipulating public opinion, and these things are actually illegal, not because they're censored, but because they're illegal for other legitimate reasons. So I think that there's one thing that we need to, and again, I think the sensitivity on both sides of the Atlantic against on censorship is perhaps different. What is seen, this case against this document that was obviously forged, the justice will have to determine whether it was forged or not, but the fact that it was taken down in some cases would not be seen in Europe or especially in France as censorship. I don't think that would be the case. So I think there's a cultural divide here, and that we don't mean the same thing when we say free speech. My question though is, should we look at this, or should we look at other solutions that are more systemic? And for example, one of the things I want to propose to the panel is, one of the things we could do is say, well, what about whatever the fake news that's created, how is it targeted and how is it served to users? And in this process, it might be the case that personal data are used in a way that is adverse to people's interests, and regulating the protection of personal data and regulation on data protection, which has nothing to do with the freedom of speech, might help tame not the existence of fake news, but the intensity of the problem that they represent. What do you think about this?
So I think, just to recap, if I may, the idea that if we have stronger protections around personal data, it may, if I'm interpreting this correctly, limit the efficacy of the campaigns to target individuals for influence and manipulation, and without necessarily affecting anyone's speech. Anyone want to jump on that?
Okay, so quickly as a wrap up. So basically, I think you point correctly. The responsibility for fake news is not only about Facebook, Google, or Twitter. There is a fake news industry going on. There are people making money, or they are working under the incentives of political victory or political disruption. And as you know, because you brought Jonathan Albright here to Columbia, this fake news industry is a very professional one. They do data collection, they do individual profiling, they do psychometrics to see if you are like upset or if you have a neurotic personality and you are like more susceptible to certain types of advertising. And I think like realizing that this has become an industry, it helps as well in terms of like how do you fight against it. So I think one of the ways of like dealing with the problem is actually understanding all the elements about that problem and understanding that there is a fake news industry among us and actually operating through very sophisticated tools, including data profiling and data collection and psychometrics. I think that that's very important. And it goes beyond the free speech issue because it has a lot of deception in this industry. So this is a deceptive industry because sometimes they serve content to you plain as if that content was being served by your regular citizen, but it's not a citizen there. It's like a very well-organized industry that is behind it. So I think the deception framework here might be important as well.
If we're in wrap-up phase, I will acknowledge the importance of the fake news discussion and underscore a lot of those comments, but I want to leave you with a rhetorical question to anyone who's from a democracy. Is it ever wrong to publicize truth? Advocates of Snowden would say no, and the Democratic National Committee might be saying yes.
Any final comments, Matthew, Camille?
No, I mean, well, I guess I would just wrap up by saying, you know, there have been a lot of questions asking about, you know, is this the solution? Is that the solution? And I think in my mind, a couple of conclusions come to mind. One is, at best, you're going to solve only parts of this problem. Second is, there is not going to be any one big, grand solution to this. It's going to probably be made up of a lot of smaller initiatives, some of them from the tech industry, some of them from civil society, some of them led by states, some of them by the international community.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. And, you know, last thought to build on what Ronaldo was saying on this industry, it's also an industry that's very close to that of the hacking industry. So when we see the social media botnets, the bots that they use are also the bots that are used in gigantic DDoS criminal operations. When we see the providers of propaganda hacking tools on the black market, really they are also the providers of malware, and they are also selling to states. And so we can sort of follow the breadcrumbs of that industry, which is not completely unknown and not completely unregulated, and sort of like, you know, meticulously tie it back to actors, models, systems, and legal frameworks that we understand and know how to apply.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
I love your reference to Karl Popper and falsifiability.
Glad you took that.